What does one do to convert to Buddhism?
Since Buddhist tradition generally does not emphasize doctrine, becoming a Buddhist ordinarily does not involve lengthy periods of education or examination on the teachings. Various Buddhist organizations do, however, produce catechism-like texts designed for beginners interested in joining the faith. There is no universally practiced ritual for welcoming converts. Perhaps the single most important ritual element in the process of becoming a Buddhist is the taking of the 3 refuges. Many who decide to become Buddhists seek the tutelage of a spiritual guide. Especially in the various Zen and Tibetan organizations. Unlike converts to some other traditions, new Buddhists seem to be less concerned with seeking salvation than with finding a personally satisfying approach to everyday life. It is perhaps ironic that a tradition that de-emphasizes doctrine attracts more people committed to studying the tradition in depth than do many traditions in which doctrine plays a more central role. Above all, Buddhists almost universally agree that nothing in any religious doctrinal system leads to salvation in itself.
Who are the Samaritans?
After the northern kingdom's capital, Samaria, was overrun by the Assyrians in 721 BCE. Many of the leading and best educated Jewish citizens were deported. The invaders imported significant numbers of colonists who gradually infiltrated the people of Israel. They came to trace their ancestry to the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim, thus identifying themselves as Jewish at least genealogically, and intermarried with Jews. The Samaritans established their own temple on Mt. Gerizim. As a result of a falling out with Nehemiah in the 5th century, the Samaritans split off from Judaism more or less definitively and came to think of themselves as a separate people. Now very few in numbers, the Samaritans still have their own version of the Torah and distinctive codes of religious law. At Passover they still sacrifice a lamb on Mt. Gerizim. Only a small community of Samaritans, well under 1,000, survive. Plagued by health problems as a result of inbreeding. Most Samaritans live around the city of Nablus in the West Bank.
Have there been any Shinto mystics?
Mainstream Shinto tradition has not been particularly noted for producing important mystical figures. That is not to say that there have been no Shinto mystics. But talk of mystical union with the divine has come more from various syncretistic schools and sects, especially those heavily influenced by non-Japanese schools of religious thought. Kurozumai Muntada, founder of the Kurozumai sect with a distinctively Neo-Confucian tilt, taught the importance of the deliberate quest to become a kami. He himself is said To have experienced oneness with the sun goddess Amaterasu when she suffused his body.
What is theology and what kinds of questions does it seek to answer?
Theology is talk or thinking, logos, about God, theos. A wide variety of religious traditions naturally engage in some kinds of theology as it is understood in this general sense. Myth at its best is a type of narrative theology. Reflections on the nature of the supreme reality that give rise to story and reenactment of myth in ritual. Some traditions develop the formal discipline of theology much more fully. In those traditions, theology generally does three things. First, it involves a systematic reflection on the basic data, including scripture and or the teachings of a foundational figure. Theologians sort out and organize the major themes, commenting on the original sources with a view to highlighting main ideas about the ultimate reality, or God, humanity, and the material world. In so doing, they effectively help earlier generations of believers to shape the community's master narrative, the guiding account by which believers begin to make sense of their lives. For Jews, it is the story of God's delivering his people from slavery and bringing them to a promised land. For Christians, it is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, in which they see victory over suffering and death, for example. Second, theologians begin to formulate a distinctive way of talking about the tradition's central teachings. At this stage, theological language grows more technical and idiosyncratic. Theology is now using a set of symbols that require some specialized training in the particular tradition to appreciate what the theologians are saying. Finally, theologians articulate those distinctive symbols into a unique system of thought.
What is the meaning of Buddhist ordination?
Ordination in the Buddhist tradition does not imply the same kind of conferral of spiritual power or authority that it does in many Christian denominations. A closer parallel would be the taking of religious vows. Young men and boys in many Buddhist denominations submit themselves for ordination to the monastic sangha under a variety of circumstances. In some cultures, boys as young as 7 can enter the monastery and receive the lower ordination, Parivraja, to the rank of novice in the order. Those who choose to stay and commit themselves to the monastic life permanently can receive the higher ordination, Upasampada, to full status of monk or bhikshu. Ordinations are often held at the start of the rain retreat, and it is not unusual for young ordinands to remain in the monastery only for one rainy season. Thai men sometimes still enter the monastery for a week or less after the death of a family member. In some areas, ordinations occur after rice harvest, since increased revenue makes for better celebrations. but the rituals can occur anytime outside of the rain retreat itself. Prospective ordinands petition the abbot of a local monastery, who might then allow them in directly if they intend only a short stay. Those who propose to remain and take the full monastic ordination eventually go through a more elaborate ritual. They kneel before 10 monks and the abbot, ask permission to enter, and receive the two-piece robe of the novice. After donning the garb, the candidates recite the 3 refuges and 10 precepts. Ordination to full membership in the monastic order repeats the novitiate ritual and adds a further examination of the candidates. Each novice receives a begging bowl and a 3-piece garment.
How does one know when he or she has crossed the moral divide?
Shame is a very powerful index of morality in Shinto tradition. What members of some traditions identify as moral guilt incurred objectively as a result of some specific act. Shinto tradition regards a breach of social contract for which the individual ought to be ashamed and seek forgiveness through purification.
Do Muslims believe in miracles?
Muhammad's early critics in Mecca sometimes taunted him for being so much like an ordinary human being. If he were really a prophet of God, surely he would entertain them with some sort of heavenly pyrotechnics. Muhammad regarded the Quran itself as his only miracle. A marvel of eloquence uttered by a man considered technically unlettered. But the scripture does refer often to spectacular signs God brought about to vindicate earlier prophets. For example, Moses' staff became a dragon that devoured Pharaoh's magicians. And Moses' hand turned white with leprosy and was then restored to health, Quran 7:107-08. Within a generation or two of Muhammad's death, tradition had begun to attribute to the prophet a number of extraordinary occurrences. He could fast for inordinately long periods, could see people behind him, heal various ailments, supply water where there was none, and stretch limited food sources as needed. Trees and stones saluted Muhammad, a pillar in his house mourned that the prophet no longer leaned on it when he preached. And the prophet split the moon in two to confound his critics. Throughout the history of Islam, holy persons called friends of God have been famous for the ability to perform wondrous deeds. Many Muslims today regard accounts of such legend and lore of secondary importance. Classical Muslim theologians devised technical terms to distinguish between two levels of miracle. They called the works God did as proof of his prophet's truthfulness evidentiary miracles, mujizat. Pronounced mujizaat, and those effected by friends of God marvels, karamat, pronounced karamaat. Theologians further called attention to key differences between works of sorcery and wonders performed authentically under divine power.
How and where do members of local Jewish communities come together?
The synagogue, from the Greek for coming together, sometimes referred to as the temple, is the principal venue of Jewish community life. More traditional synagogues have served very localized communities, especially for Jews who choose to observe Sabbath restrictions on the use of motor vehicles and prefer to walk to worship. It is more usual nowadays for Reform synagogues especially to draw members from much greater distances, shifting their scope from neighborhood to wider metropolitan area or even broader region. Many synagogues, especially those serving wealthier communities, are parts of extensive complexes. Some include libraries, auditoriums for plays and concerts, and even art galleries, in addition to worship space. Some with both larger and smaller spaces, staff offices, and facilities for social functions.
How do Hindus feel when one of their members decides to leave the faith?
Membership in most smaller local Hindu communities across India is so intimately linked with a larger network of social and economic factors that the notion of leaving the faith is virtually meaningless. To live in the community is to be a Hindu. In the big cosmopolitan cities like Bombay, Calcutta, and Delhi, the matter is naturally more complex. Social relations are undergoing a higher rate of change in some places. But even there, most people who think of themselves as Hindu will likely continue to do so, whether or not they participate regularly in traditional religious observances. When individuals make a conscious effort to forsake the tradition altogether because they find that it no longer meets their needs, their families experience a sense of loss. One fewer member of the clan participates in the family's observance of the sacred occasions that have offered a sense of togetherness and joy. Individuals who drift away from traditional practice often continue to call themselves Hindu as a cultural identifier. And among immigrant families in the United States, for example, a surprising number of younger adults find themselves going in the opposite direction. Many feel a desire to return to the tradition because of an interest in their cultural roots.
What is a holy city and how do cities become holy?
Dozens of cities, towns, and villages across the globe have become especially sacred. Some places actually start off sacred. People acknowledge a place as the site of a unique revelatory event, often called a theophany, or divine manifestation. Some people choose to settle around the sacred site. Since holiness is often associated with natural features conducive to human habitation. Springs, rivers, fertile soil, settlements can develop and expand. Other sacred places begin unremarkably as centers of population and acquire their sacredness later. Often because a holy person has lived there. Whatever the genesis of a city's sacred character, people often come to believe that the place has always been holy. Over a period of centuries, a holy city may take on more and more religious associations, so that eventually believers regard it as the place where virtually everything of religious significance has happened. The holy city thus becomes a spiritual world unto itself. In a similar way, if believers perceive their holy city not only as the place where it all began but the place it will all come to an end, the city also becomes a microcosm of history. All power and even time itself comes into focus in this one place, this center of the universe. Though it may seem an affront to logic, this kind of symbolic religious cosmology sometimes finds room for more than one center. In other words, some traditions claim several sacred cities, often ranked hierarchically, but all uniquely sacred. This has its own logic, wherever believers gather. For whatever reason, there is the meeting place of heaven and earth.
What is the meaning of the hand symbol?
Silhouettes of a five-fingered open hand appear often as a motif in jewelry and on staffs that function as standards in some Shi'i religious rituals. Called the Five, the symbol reminds devotees of the five principal members of the Prophet's family: Muhammad, Fatima, Ali, Hassan, and Hussein. Many Shiite mosques display the hand as a finial on both domes and minarets in mosques of classical design. Sometimes the hand was hoisted atop a staff as a battle standard, emblazoned with prayers to Ali on the fingers and the names of all 12 imams encircling the palm. As a symbol used by Muslims in various parts of the world by Muslims of various communities, the hand functions as a talismanic magical device, a symbol of control or power associated with Muhammad's daughter Fatima.
Have there been important Hindu mystics?
Many of the Sants certainly rank among India's greatest mystics. Their poems and songs represent one of the two major strands of supernormal unitive experience, often described as mystical. For the Sants and other exponents of the Bhakti tradition, the divine-human relationship is above all intensely personal. It is precisely the infinite chasm separating God from the human devotee that gives their conviction of the transforming love of God its immense power. This type of mysticism is often called theistic or dualistic. A number of important devotional schools trace their origins to some of the most influential theistic mystics, such as Vallabha and Chaitanya. Another stream tributary to the great river of Hindu mysticism is often referred to as cosmic or monistic. Teachers like Shankara emphasize the need to arrive through disciplined meditation at the full realization that there is no divide between what most of us perceive as the individual and the ultimate reality. that realization of the simple unity of Brahman and Atman, which conventional language might call God and the soul, is the essence of the monistic mystical experience.
What was the religion in ancient Egypt?
Religion was the very core of ancient Egyptian culture, 3500 BCE 950 BCE. It permeated every aspect of life, including art, medicine, and science. Egyptians believed that the gods had created Egypt as an oasis of order and inherent good amidst the forces of chaos that constantly threatened to overwhelm them. Justice, morality, and beauty called Ma'at by the Egyptians consisted of behavior in accordance with that tradition. The Egyptian religion featured many deities, some strange but with human features. Others clearly non-human, but all responsible for every aspect of life, from birth to death. The king of the gods was Amon-Re, followed by Aten, the disk that symbolized the sun god. Osiris, the god of both the Nile and the realm of the dead, and Isis, the moon goddess, wife of Osiris, mother of the universe, and queen of the world. Each god was associated with a particular sacred animal: cat, bull, crocodile, or scarab, beetle, and huge temples were dedicated to their worship. In these temples, which were run by priests, the gods and goddesses made contact with humans through cult statues. Ordinary people prayed at the temple gates and were not normally allowed inside. Though they were offered a peek at the Egyptian gods during great processions.
Are there other important cyclical observances based largely on celestial signs?
Every 3 years Hindus gather from all over India in one of 4 sacred cities: Hardwar, Prayaga, Ujjain, and Nasik, each on a different sacred river or confluence, for a huge religious fair called a Kumbh Mela, Grainpot Festival. The mythological connection in the name is its reference to the kumbha, or vessel, from which drops of the nectar of immortality fell as the demons rested on their flight from the gods, making the 4 cities holy. Every 12 years, a series of astrological conjunctions make the gathering at Prayaga, known by Muslims as Allahabad, particularly auspicious. Since about the 8th century, travelers have made organized pilgrimages to the 4 cities to attain forgiveness of sins for themselves and 88 generations of ancestors by bathing in their sacred waters 4 times each year, corresponding to the 2 solstices and 2 equinoxes. Are particularly important events in the solar calendar. The beginning of every solar month is auspicious because of the sun's move into a new sign of the zodiac. But the winter solstice is the most important because it signals the lengthening of days and the beginning of the solar year.
Are there distinctive forms of Islamic initiation?
Teenagers can be welcomed formally into the adult community of believers with a simple ceremony, during which the young man or woman pronounces the Shahada before 2 male or 8 female witnesses. Sometimes the occasion is combined with a regular congregational prayer service on Friday afternoon. But the ritual can also take place in the home. The young Muslims so initiated may also recite various prayers in Arabic as part of the ceremony. There is ordinarily no reception following the ritual. As a rite of passage, the ritual itself is roughly parallel to the Jewish bar and bat mitzvah.
Did Jesus found Christianity as a distinct religious tradition?
Jesus and the Buddha had this in common: they were both primarily teachers who offered what were judged to be non-traditional interpretations of already ancient traditions. Neither seems to have set out deliberately to found a new religious community, though they both gathered about themselves the nucleus of what would eventually become distinct institutional structures. As such, Jesus and the Buddha were foundational figures rather than founders. Leaders among their immediate communities inherited the task of working out the organizational details. A number of able leaders emerged from the early followers of Jesus. They included in particular Peter, one of the original 12 apostles, and Paul, a Pharisee from Asia Minor who had experienced a dramatic change of religious orientation.
Is there such a thing as a Shinto saint?
Many exemplary human beings have been identified and revered as kami after their deaths. Since the category of kami is an all-inclusive grouping of forces and persons considered above the merely human, Shinto tradition has no need of an intermediary category such as that of saint. Most traditions that discuss sainthood in one form or another do so out of one of two convictions. In some traditions the deity is so exalted and transcendent that ordinary human beings can scarcely imagine approaching it directly. Saints function as intermediaries because they share the humanity of devotees and are thus more approachable. Other traditions, however, elevate certain persons not as intermediaries or intercessors, but as examples of lofty yet attainable perfection. Shinto stands alone here in the sense that the kami are everywhere and thus perfectly accessible, and that certain human beings are themselves kami.
What kind of religious calendar do Buddhists observe?
Since Buddhism has long been identified with so many different cultural settings, there is some variation in the ways Buddhists keep track of sacred times. The basic religious calendar remains tied, at least nominally, to the ancient Hindu combination of lunar and solar reckoning. but many Buddhists now observe some festivities on fixed dates. The earliest Buddhists apparently did not concern themselves with marking special occurrences on their calendar. But within a generation or so, India's growing and spreading Buddhist communities began to incorporate religious social occasions into ordinary life. As Buddhist communities arose outside of India, they naturally tended to blend religious observances imported by Buddhist missionaries with the indigenous festivities of the land. In most places where Buddhism is an important presence today, the reckoning of years begins with the date of the Buddha's entry into nirvana, which coincided with his death. In any given year, Buddhists observe various special occasions. Some commemorate major events in the life of the Buddha. Others celebrate different institutional features of the tradition, others are tied to seasonal festivities. And still others are linked to special events only in certain countries.
What is negative mysticism?
Certain Christians believe in the absolute unknowability of God. To them, even the Trinity fails substantially to capture or transmit the true nature of what they consider to be a God beyond God, a mystical, indistinct presence. For such believers, God can be known only by following a negative path that treats God as a divine mystery, eternally dark and invisible to human beings. The closest we can come to knowing God is through the love and goodness that is revealed to humankind by God's own action. An early exponent of this belief was Pseudo-Dionysius, who envisioned a superessential Godhead distinctive from all positive terms ascribed to God. Later, in the 14th century, the English author of The Cloud of Unknowing advocated a negative path to God. Today, the practice of negative mysticism is not widespread, but some Christians find it helpful to imagine what God is not in their quest to understand God as He is. Some refer to this as apophatic mysticism, to distinguish it from the cataphatic tradition, in which proponents believe one can make more affirmative statements of mystical experience.
What is the Ark of the Covenant?
Part of the revelation Moses received at Sinai included specific instructions from God about how to prepare a holy place in which the people could come to be in the presence of God. First they were to fashion a special tent, called the tabernacle. Then the ark in which the tablets of the law would be kept. The ark was to be a gold-clad box of acacia wood of specific dimensions. It was to have 2 rings on either side to accommodate poles for carrying it. Since the ark had to be portable, the people were still on the move. On top there was to be a mercy seat made of gold in the shape of 2 cherubs facing each other, whose wings would spread over the mercy seat. Ironically, this feature of the most sacred of all ritual objects must have been one of the rare examples of three-dimensional figural art in the history of Judaism. The mercy seat was to be a symbol of the place to which God would descend to meet Moses. Inside the tabernacle a large veil was to separate the larger part of the space from a space called the Holy of Holies, in which the ark would be kept. From then on, the ark would travel with Israel, resting only temporarily in any given location. Until Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem. In the temple the ark was to reside permanently in the innermost part, also called the Holy of Holies.
What is the connection between orthodoxy and heresy, and what is heterodoxy?
Orthodoxy, from the Greek orthodox, correct opinion, is in a way the diametric opposite of heterodoxy, Greek, heterodox, variant opinion. Heterodoxy is a generic category used to refer to any and all doctrinal views at odds with mainstream thinking in a tradition. Heresy, from the Greek herio, to seize, choose, decide, in other words. To take a position, is one of the more common ways of characterizing heterodox views. In general, heresy refers to the deliberate holding of a set of beliefs in direct opposition to a religious tradition's established and widely accepted authority. It is important to keep in mind that fully articulated conceptions of orthodoxy typically develop long after the earliest generations of a given tradition have come and gone. During their early decades, even centuries in some cases, many religious traditions have historically allowed for some diversity of views. But one or another of those views can become so extreme that a majority of believers perceive a threat to their cohesiveness as a community. To hold such a threat at bay, religious communities sometimes find it necessary to define the limits of acceptable divergence of beliefs. The term heretical has sometimes been used to describe certain sectarian movements that form in response to restrictive definitions of orthodoxy.
Is there such a thing as Shinto art or aesthetic?
Every 20 years, priests and specially skilled carpenters gather at the Grand Shrine at ISE for a ritual that says a lot about Shinto artistic sensibilities. They construct a new inner shrine on a plot left vacant for the previous 20 years. Then they dismantle the older shrine, separated by only a small partition, and leave its space empty until it is time to rebuild there. The carpenters use only the finest cypress, fashioned with the simplest of tools, and use no nails, adhesives, or artificially produced material of any kind. Each stroke of the plane or hammer is part of an ancient ritual that blends religious reverence and awe with the practical demands of sacred architecture. Each structure, however small and humble, is a work of sacred craftsmanship. During the Middle Ages, Shinto sculptors created anthropomorphic images of various kami. largely under the influence of Buddhism's rich iconography. Some sculptures remain important symbols in a few individual devotional cults within Shinto, such as Suno Ichijutsu, with its images of the kami's monkey messengers. But on the whole, modern Shinto worship is aniconic, focusing on the presence of symbolic objects, such as the mirror and sword, within the Holy of Holies. A unique and historically important art form is the so-called shrine mandala. Stylized depictions of individual shrines arrange the sacred site as a meditative device on a hanging scroll. Members of certain sects have used these mandalas as devotional focuses of esoteric contemplative rituals. Above all, shrines and their settings remain the most important visual expression of Shinto beliefs and values. Simple, natural beauty is the key.
What are the main Islamic notions of the afterlife?
Muslim eschatology has much in common with most Christian and some Jewish traditions about the afterlife. Death is not the end of life, but a transition to another level of existence. Muslims believe human beings are accountable for all of their free moral decisions. People are not held similarly responsible for actions with negative consequences but done under duress or in the absence of intent to do evil. Numerous texts of the Quran warn of the coming day of judgment. The day of resurrection, the hour in which the true quality of everyone's deeds will be revealed. On the basis of that accounting, individuals will go across a narrow passage of no return called the Barzakh, pronounced Barzakh, to one of several destinations. Paradise is called the garden, Jannah, pronoun Jannah. A verdant place of repose and delight, an oasis for the just. Heaven is not so much literally a place as a state of being whose principal feature is the vision of God. Quranic texts refer to several different levels or degrees of heavenly reward. Hell, known as the fire or Gehenna. Jahannam, pronounced Jahannam, represents the state of refusal to acknowledge God's sovereignty. Some Muslim theologians have taught that hell is not necessarily a permanent state, since God can always forgive any sin except unrelenting denial of God's existence. Hell can thus function in a way similar to that of the state of purgatory in Christian tradition. Though Islamic tradition does not have a separate term for that state of purification. Muslim tradition also hints at something like an intermediate state, perhaps similar to the Christian idea of limbo.
Is meditation important in Daoism or CCT?
Dominant forms of devotional expression in CCT tend to be associated with more extroverted ritual and supplicatory prayer. Classical and later Daoist sources, on the other hand, describe various meditative methods designed to help the practitioner turn inward. In fact, Chan Buddhism The Chinese precursor to the more famous Japanese Zen, seems to have borrowed much from Daoism in this respect. The meditator sits and forgets in the presence of nature, engaging in the fast of the mind. Principal stages in Daoist meditative technique are the following. First, the meditator calms the body by adopting a fixed posture and slow, regular breathing. As the meditator becomes one with his or her breathing, distractions begin to dissolve. To develop greater concentration, the meditator chooses a specific symbolic focus for detailed visualization. In the next stage, the meditator moves beyond this discursive intellectualizing into the fast of the mind. Leaving behind all symbols and ideas, the meditator enters a realm where images are irrelevant. Finally, the meditator loses all sense of self and attains union with the Dao.
Is there a distinctively Shinto ethic?
Some have characterized Shinto as a type of naturalistic humanism that begins with the conviction of innate human goodness. When evil gains the ascendancy, it is not because of some inherent or inherited human tendency. Evil advances whenever human beings lose their concentration on life at its simplest, most basic level. As an ethical ideal, the concept of Makoto means something like genuineness or authenticity. An ethical person is one who characteristically makes choices unspoiled by ulterior motives. Purity of intention thus takes precedence over adherence to any specific set of commands and prohibitions. Scholars refer to an ethic of this kind as contextual or situational. All acts derive their moral value from the overall setting in which people perform them. A virtuous person is one who enjoys maximum harmony with the totality of the powers of nature.
What signs or symbols might identify an individual as Christian?
Except in a few rare traditional societies in which ordinary garb can still distinguish members of different religious traditions. Ordinary Christians typically display few obvious signs of their religious affiliations. The most common symbols are small items of jewelry, such as rings or necklaces, displaying the symbol of the cross. Another decorative symbol is the stylized outline of a fish, with or without an enclosed text. Sometimes the fish has the word Jesus written within it, sometimes the Greek word for fish, ichthys. The symbolism of that Greek word derives from an ancient acronym meaning Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, Isis Christos Theoios Soter. Fish symbols often take the form of metal automobile decorations or bumper stickers. Individuals wearing or displaying either the cross or the fish symbol might belong to any of a number of Christian denominations or communities. Angels have become extraordinarily popular in recent years among Christians of all persuasions and can be seen on such objects as lapel pins or dashboard magnets. Other small identifying items are distinctively Roman Catholic. Various kinds of medals hung around the neck, or rings, might depict Jesus, his mother Mary, a patron saint, or an angel. Catholics sometimes use a variation on the more generic and plain Christian cross, called the crucifix, which depicts the body of the suffering Christ. In addition, Catholics and Orthodox Christians may make the sign of the cross in public, asking a blessing on the activity at hand.
What do the terms salvation and redemption mean for Christians?
All of the major religious traditions hold out the prospect that human beings can find a way out of the suffering, confusion, and alienation that are part of everyone's life. Some traditions emphasize that only steadfast adherence to a core of ethical doctrine can effect the ultimate transformation of the human condition. Others teach that even the strongest, best motivated and most determined individuals need assistance from a greater than human power. Grace is a widely used term for that superhuman or divine aid, and it is the power of salvation. Some traditions go so far as to say that grace alone, apart from any human action, has the power to save. Religious doctrine about the source, nature and function of such saving power is called soteriology, from the Greek soter, savior. Christianity and Buddhism, and to a slightly lesser extent Hinduism, have developed the most elaborate soteriologies. For Christians generally, God sending Jesus Christ to die and rise from the dead for humankind brings about salvation through victory over evil and death. But in addition to rescuing believers, Christ also redeems. From the Latin meaning to buy back, them from their former condition. According to some Christian thinkers, this means a restoration to the condition of original innocence that human beings enjoyed prior to the fall. Strictly speaking, Buddhist and Hindu notions of salvation are about release from the status quo and do not include this element of reinstatement. Christian soteriology is about both salvation and redemption.
Do Jewish communities practice excommunication or banishment for religious reasons?
Concern for purity led to the expulsion of lepers, those impure because of contact with the dead, and those suffering from a discharge of bodily fluids. From the camp of the Israelites as described in Book of Numbers 5:1-4. Lepers especially were considered not only unhealthy but ritually and ethically unclean, due to the prevalent belief that such an affliction implied some moral guilt on the part of either the individual or the leper's parents. Elsewhere in the Hebrew scripture we hear of the practice of Hur-em, placing a ban on certain things, such as the spoils of war or the results of ritual sacrifice. In biblical usage, to ban an item was to dedicate it totally to the Lord. Later Jewish tradition used the term Hur-em to apply to a kind of excommunication. when authenticated instances of heretical views came to the attention of rabbinical authorities. They could banish the culprit from the community. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza, 1632–1677, for example, was excommunicated from the Sephardic community for his insistence on the primacy of reason and for views judged to be pantheistic. Earlier, a Portuguese Jew named Uriel de Costa, 1585–1640, underwent formal excommunication twice and endured public humiliation for his unacceptable views. Some interpret both Spinoza and de Costa as examples of a clash between Enlightenment views and traditional Jewish beliefs.
What is religious cosmology and what sorts of issues does it address?
Virtually every religious tradition has developed distinctive interpretations of how the world came to be and what it means spiritually. Cosmology, talk or thinking about the cosmos, includes traditional views about time and space and what it means to be embodied. A common element in cosmology is cosmogony or notions of how the cosmos came into being. Creation from nothing is a characteristic theme in Abrahamic cosmogonies. Asian cosmogonies include a wide spectrum of stories, from the spontaneous evolution of the primal egg to the orderly elaboration of each living species, to the playful creative dance of the deity, to the violent sacrifice or dismemberment of the deity itself. Variations on the ancient theory of emanation have made their way into a number of religious traditions, including the Mediterranean systems influenced by Neoplatonism. Cosmologies also typically take a position on the structure or order of the cosmos, offering views as to the origins of human societies and their rituals. This world can be real or illusory, positive or evil, a work of art or the result of haphazard evolution. A mistake even the Supreme Being would like to change or the outcome of careful divine planning. A place to stay forever or a living hell to be escaped at the earliest opportunity. Time and change also occupy cosmological thinking, with linear and cyclical models forming the major options for understanding where it's all heading.
Have relics ever been important for Muslims?
Popular Islamic spirituality in many parts of the world has included devotional practices associated with the tombs of holy persons. People visit the shrines of the friends of God in hopes of gaining blessings and other special favors as a result of saintly intercession. Many of these shrines hold items the saint is believed to have owned, such as headgear, a special symbolic frock called the kirka, walking staff, begging bowl, prayer beads, or symbolic weapon. Devotees who come to the shrines sometimes receive an object, such as a simple head wrapping or other token, that has been in contact with the holy person's tomb. Only one object has been similarly associated with Muhammad. Since the 13th century, Turkish Muslims believed they owned the so-called mantle of the Prophet. A green robe now in the possession of the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul. People there and in many other countries still recite a traditional poem called the Burda. Mantle poem, during the observance of Muhammad's birthday. But the mantle itself has never been the focus of devotional practice, as have the relics of many friends of God. Sacred footprints function in Islamic tradition, as in many others as well, like relics. Pilgrims to Mecca say special prayers at the Station of Abraham just opposite the door of the Kaaba. A small glass and gold-colored cupola covers a small stone said to contain footprints God caused Abraham to leave in the softened stone as a proof of his prophethood. Tradition says that as Muhammad rose heavenward on his ascension, he left still visible prints in the large stone beneath the dome of the rock. Muhammad's footprints became the inspiration for several types of visual symbolism still popular in North Africa, for example. Footprints of Ali have likewise been at the devotional center of a number of shrines.
Who are some important women in the history of Hindu spirituality?
Ancient tradition acknowledges that some anonymous women were among the authors of the Vedic hymns. Many other women whose names we know have made major contributions throughout the history of Hinduism. Here is a brief introduction to 4 of the better-known women from various denominations. Antal, 725–55 CE, was one of the Alvars, poet saints in the Vaishnava tradition. She was most famous for poetry in which she described her relationship with Vishnu in the language of bridal mysticism. Seeing herself as the spouse of Vishnu, she shares the spiritual longing of women mystics in other traditions who speak of total loving union with God. Devotees still sing hymns that set her poems to music. Mahadevi was a 12th century devotee of Shiva and a renowned poet in the Kannada language. In the temple of her village, the principal deity was a form of Shiva called Mallikarjun, Lord White as Jasmine. Like Antal, she thought of herself as betrothed to God alone. She was apparently forced into an unhappy marriage, and much of her poetry alludes to the suffering she experienced and her longing to be liberated and live for God alone. A late medieval holy woman named Mirabai, 1498–1550, was a devotee of Krishna. She thought of herself as a gopi who had been hopelessly enamored of the dark Lord. After extricating herself from an unsatisfactory marriage, she became a sannyasi and composed love songs in Hindi, a vernacular tongue in west-central India. Finally, a woman known by the honorific title Anandamayi Ma, bliss-steeped mother, lived in modern-day Bengal, now Bangladesh. Nirmala Sundari, 1896–1982, lived a most colorful life, often flouting strict tradition in favor of sometimes highly symbolic or ecstatic behavior. In her later years she opted for a more settled life, founding an ashram and ministering to disciples who sought her out for spiritual guidance.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT believe in heaven and hell?
Since long before the beginnings of religious Daoism, the notion of heaven, Tian, as an impersonal transcendent reality has been very important to the Chinese. Some deists have identified heaven as the first materialization, or a kind of emanation, of the Dao's spiritual power. In this sense, heaven becomes an intermediary between the unmanifest Dao and all of creation. For heaven is the source of all good things. Along with earth and humanity, heaven is one of the three powers that bring about life as we know it. However, deists do not generally talk of heaven as the eternal abode of those who lived virtuously on earth. One region beyond ordinary earthly experience is the Isles of the Blessed, Pen Lai Shan. In the far reaches of the Eastern Sea, where the eight immortals dwell amid an idyllic landscape. Many Chinese express the hope of finally reaching the Isles and attain immortality there. Belief in retribution after death for a less than praiseworthy life has given rise to a wealth of imagery. But Daoism and CCT call hell a multi-storied earthly prison. There are 10 levels of hell. Some prefer to talk of 10 separate hells, each with its ruling deity. They function rather like the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno, each designated for those who commit specific sins and crimes. Presiding over the first level is a sort of chief judge, who wields authority over the other 9 judge kings. Some souls never make it to their assigned hell, a difficult passageway to the hope of better things beyond that. They spend eternity wandering aimlessly and forever hungry, dependent on the kindness of the living to attend to their needs. Some sources talk of hell much as many Christians describe purgatory as temporary suffering with long-range benefits.
The two schools. What are Hinduism's various spiritual paths?
Karma/action, proper ritual and ethical action as a means to spiritual progress, including purification of one's deeds through detachment from the fruits of one's actions. Jnana/knowledge, attainment of intuitive or mystical understanding of the essential unity of all reality, resulting from meditative approach to the scriptures and wisdom traditions. Bhakti/devotion, participation in the divine life through devotion to a chosen manifestation of the deity. Complete emotional attachment to the chosen deity, and unselfish service to God.
What was the specific occasion on which this particular text was revealed to Muhammad? Was it revealed in connection with any unusual or momentous event? Was it a direct response to some question or predicament that had arisen in the early Muslim community?
contemporary Muslims can dip into an enormous reservoir of traditional scholarship for help in interpreting the Quran. Exegetes began compiling detailed and extensive commentaries on the sacred scripture as early as the 8th century. They refined the tools of a specialty called tafsir, pronounced tafseer, explanation, elaboration. Dozens of multi-volume works in Arabic, plus countless more in various other languages, of great antiquity and authority, are still widely available from publishers of Islamic books, and many are now being translated into Western languages. Classical commentators and modern-day interpreters alike look first to the Hadith for help on obscure passages of the Quran. For Muhammad himself often responded to questions about specific texts. Careful study of Arabic grammar and a wide knowledge of other works of Arabic literature for purposes of comparison are also essential background for professional exegetes. In addition to elucidating the basic or literal meanings of a sacred text, Quran commentary can also probe into further levels of meaning. Muslim mystics especially have written allegorical or symbolic interpretations, called ta'wil, pronounced ta'wil, to uncover the deeper spiritual implications of the scripture.
Do Christians engage in exorcism?
Many readers will be at least vaguely familiar with a novel called The Exorcist, or with the movie based on it. The author based his story loosely on a now legendary series of events said to have taken place in St. Louis, Missouri some 50 years ago. Exorcism has long been available to Roman Catholics as a ritual designed to free individuals thought to be possessed and tormented by evil spirits. Church authorities have very rarely given permission to perform exorcisms, and only after extensive psychiatric and medical consultation. The local bishop appoints a priest known for his sanctity, sanity, and personal strength to act as the principal ritual specialist. That exorcist then prepares to use a set ritual and to subject himself to whatever spiritual discipline may be necessary to withstand the rigors of the experience. Peculiar and frightening occurrences are said to accompany exorcisms. Father William Bowdern, the Jesuit priest who performed the St. Louis exorcism, refused ever to speak of the experience in public, except to affirm that he did indeed believe in the existence of the devil. According to the New Testament, Jesus and his apostles performed a number of exorcisms, a practice not altogether rare among Jews and pagans of the time. His actions are the ultimate sanction for the practice in Roman Catholicism. During medieval and even into early modern times, some people were executed as witches because they proved impervious to exorcism. Until about 30 years ago, Roman Catholic practice continued to confer on candidates to the priesthood the minor order or office of exorcist. Exorcism remains relatively common among some Christian denominations, especially Pentecostal or charismatic groups. Leaders of worship might perform an exorcism as one among many manifestations of the Spirit. By prayer and touch intended to free the one possessed. Here exorcism is generally a very brief part of the larger ritual. A much simplified form of exorcism remains a brief preliminary part of the ritual of baptism in many churches.
Have there ever been schisms or heresies in Hinduism?
Toward the end of the Vedic period we find the first clear references to groups called Nastikas. Those who deny or naysayers. Early Jains and Buddhists represented the most important of the non-orthodox groups that eventually developed into distinct religious traditions. Nastikas are generically distinguished from the Astikas, those who affirmed the authority of the Vedas, the existence of an indestructible soul, and the existence of God as an essential salvific power. Exponents of Brahmanic or priestly Hinduism have had a particularly large stake in combating the erosive influence of various nonconformist sectarian developments over many centuries. Some have eventually been reabsorbed into the greater Hinduism while others, such as Buddhism and Jainism, have remained distinct.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT celebrate the birthdays of any religious figures?
Deities both great and small are generally thought to have birthdays because the vast majority of them were once human beings. CCT has transformed numerous figures originally deist, Buddhist, and Confucian into more comfortable characters, members of everybody's family, in effect. Other deities remain in their more exalted original deist forms. The following are only a few of the literally hundreds of divine birthday dates. Among the earliest in the year is the Jade Emperor, celebrated on the 9th of the first month. On the third day of the second month, CCT acknowledges Wen Changdijun, the god of literature and learning. Guanyin's birthday occurs on the 19th of the second month. Xiantian Shangdi, the supreme emperor of dark heaven, was born on the 3rd of the third month and is celebrated in some 400 Taiwanese temples. A quasi-deist deity called the Great Emperor who protects life, Bao Sheng Da Di, is celebrated on the 15th of the third month. Ma Ziu, often referred to as the Great Aunt or Grandma, has her celebration on the 23rd of the third month. On the 13th day of month 5 the general become deity Guandi gets his due. An otherwise anonymous city god's day is the 15th of the 6th month. Devotees of CCT observe the birthdays of Cao Jun on the 3rd day of the 8th month, and that of Tu Digong on the 15th. Also on the 3rd of that month deists celebrate the birthday of Si Ming, the director of destiny, known in CCT as the kitchen god or hearth deity.
What is meant by the term Chinese Community Traditions, CCT?
Much more ancient than religious or even earlier philosophical Daoism are the various currents of popular religious belief and practice that together comprise what will be referred to as Chinese Community Traditions or CCT. Historians of religion suggest that most Chinese who engage in public expression of religious beliefs actually belong to this broad popular stream. Many of their beliefs have Daoist connections, but, unlike Daoism as such, CCT has not been associated with formal religious institutions such as priesthood and monastic orders, and does not possess a scriptural canon. Many beliefs and practices now widespread in popular tradition also have roots in ancient Confucian and imperial cultic institutions, and in Buddhism as well. Countless CCT temples began to appear in towns and villages several centuries ago. Since they do not have their own resident ritual specialists, these temples often enlist the services of Daoist priests. But their day-to-day services are often handled by dedicated laypersons. Many such temples are associated with families who maintain them as a public service and a family tradition. Some elements of CCT also appear in temples ostensibly identified as Buddhist. A Guanyin temple in Honolulu, for example, combines Buddhist rituals with a host of other popular practices. Though the main image is that of the Buddha, numerous other icons are prominently displayed. That particular temple is run by a group of Chinese Buddhist nuns who are especially concerned with preserving the image that theirs is a purely Buddhist temple, in spite of the obvious diversity within it. Recently, when a visitor asked permission to snap a few photos inside, the nun in charge agreed. But whenever she thought his camera lens was wandering toward Confucius or another icon, she tugged his sleeve and waved a disapproving finger at him. Only Buddha, she insisted. Just a few blocks away, above a small upholstery shop, is the Lum family temple. There, all the deities are clearly of the CCT variety. Even though some are often inaccurately identified as Daoist.